All right, welcome everyone to our session 2 session on classical education in hybrid schools. So I was going to come to this session anyway, so I thought I would just go ahead and be the moderator of the session. I have a particular interest in this. I think it's an interesting thing that classical schools and hybrid schools are kind of evolving along similar tracks over time, right? So if you think back to maybe the 80s, we had a little bit of a restart of the classical education movement. And then in the 90s, you had things like Classical Academic Press and the Circe Institute and ACCS were all founded in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, things kind of started taking off. And in the last 10 years, we've gotten to these really big growth stages for a lot of different classical education organizations. And the same kind of thing happened with hybrid schools, right? We had a couple maybe in the 80s, in the very late 80s. In the 90s, we had a few more. In the 2000s, they started solidifying. And then now they're popping up everywhere. And a high percentage of the newest hybrid schools tend to be classical schools. And so clearly there's some interest because you're all here in this room. So we have 3 fantastic people to talk about their experiences with classical education in hybrid schools. And I think we're going to start with John Henry Spann from St. John Bosco Academy, which is not too far from here.
Thank you, guys. So I'm going to be straightforward with you. I'm a little intimidated because every single person I've ever met is in this room. All of my best friends are here. My bride just appeared in the back with a box of pizza. And so I apologize if I'm a little, I've got a little nerves up here. But my name is John Henry Spann. I'm the Dean of Academics at St. John Bosco Academy in Cumming, Georgia, which isn't far from here. Got 4 kids in the school. My 5th is in the back, still hanging out beside of my beautiful bride. She'll be here in a couple of months. And Eric came to me a few months ago and asked me to be on this panel. And he told me that the topic was something along the lines of, why are so many hybrid schools Catholic? Can you get into that? Or I'm sorry, why are so many hybrid schools classical? Can you get into that? And if I'm honest, it kind of stuck me for a minute. I didn't really have like a knee-jerk reaction. And so I started thinking about what originally attracted me to classical education. And if I'm being straightforward, I think it was mostly because I liked beards and philosophy and old guy. I just was into that aesthetic, right? I thought that was neat. And I like poking modern education in the eye a little bit. But I started to sort of dig into it and really think about why I thought that the two melded so well together and why we see this sort of dovetailing of hybrid education and classical education more and more. When I'm usually asked what it means that our school is classical, I usually quote Dr. Ian Malcolm. You might know Dr. Ian Malcolm. He has a PhD in mathematics. He's some Texas-based fella. He specializes in chaos theory, and he got famous because he had this interaction with the CEO of some big genetic editing company, right? And he said something along the lines of, your scientists were too preoccupied with whether or not they could. They didn't stop to think whether or not they should. And he ended up to be right. And 5 people ended up dying who worked for that genetic company when the power went out and all the dinosaurs got out at Isla Nublar, because this is the plot of Jurassic Park. But it's true, right? And that is Dr. Ian Malcolm's quote, I think, still stands, right? From a classical education point, that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to do, right? We're learning for the sake of something, right? For the sake of deepening and appreciating what is true and what is good and what is beautiful, and elevating the human mind, not just to understand what we can do, but what we should do, right? I have what we call a catechism at the beginning of all of my classes, where my students, they essentially memorize about 1.5 pages of questions and answers, right? And one of the things one of the questions that I ask them at the beginning of every single class is, why do I need a classical education? And part of their response is, quote, the classically educated Christian does not ask what I can do with this learning, but what will this learning do to me? The ultimate end of classical education is to enable me to better know, glorify, and enjoy God, right? And regardless of whether we're discussing a hybrid school or not, I would argue that as educators, right, our goals, this is primarily our goal for these students, right? It's not just helping students gain knowledge and apply information, but to help them discern what's worth knowing and how to apply that knowledge and rightly ordering their minds and their lives for the sake of knowing what is true and good and beautiful, right? Knowing things for the sake of something is what we're after. And I can talk a lot about classical education and what it has to do in regards to what they're actually learning inside the classroom, right? And restoring them some sense of their Western heritage and tradition and all of these things. But I think more practically and more importantly, for a little 10-minute spiel, is the importance that, or the fact that classical education and hybrid schools dovetail so well together because of that prioritization of time and what they spend that time on, right? At every open house that I give at St. John Bosco, I give a little spiel. I stand up and I say something to the effect of, I'm the Dean of Academics, but I want to make it really, really clear that our priority here is not academics, right? I'm not even just saying that's not our top priority. I'm saying that's not in the top 10, right? There's so many things that are more important for us, right? For me, for my students, than getting good test grades and beating the SATs or whatever. And I hope that if you're in this classroom that academics are not in the top 10 list for your students either, right? The things that are more important than academics off the top of my head, I mean, I wrote it down, but salvation, their relationship with God, their vocation, their growth in virtue, their relationship with their parents, their relationship with their peers, their understanding of their own identity, their understanding of the part they play in our society, right? Their culture. There's 100 different things that are more important for their well-being and their formation as a good, virtuous human than test scores. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I think that you can do both, right? I'm not trying to say that I don't care at all about good grades. That's a big part of my job. I want our kids to get good grades. If college is the path they're after, I want them to get to a good college. I want them to make lots of money. I want them to donate to a big endowment fund. I want all of these things, right? But that's not my primary goal. And if you're interested only in churning out wage earners who can pull in a big paycheck and get the honor of paying taxes until the day that they die, then there are some great public schools that you should apply for. But if you're interested in working with parents to form good humans, virtuous human beings, right, who are fighting for good in their salvation, then classical education, I think, is the way to go. I don't want to hide the ball at all. I am a Roman Catholic. I believe that the fullness of truth is found in the Catholic Church. I believe that church was founded by Jesus Christ and that we exist for the purpose of knowing, loving, and serving God so we can spend eternity with him. I was paying attention when I learned the Baltimore Catechism when I was 5th grade. But as a result of my Catholicity, right, my philosophy of education might be different from yours, but if your school is faith-based or if your school acknowledges objective truths in general, then I bet we're all going to agree on those points regarding priority, right? And the hybrid school works so well with this because it rightly orients our students' priorities towards all of those non-academic aspects of their education that are more important than what's going on in the classroom. And if you do it right, you do that without sacrificing any academic rigor. So in the last couple of minutes I've got, I want to run through just some practical points about why hybrid and classical schools complement each other so well. Especially in light of this understanding that we're after virtue, right? Most importantly, hybrid schools, right? They focus students first and foremost, not around the school, right? Your biggest benefit as a hybrid school from a classical mindset is that the school is not the focus of that kid's life, right? They're focused around their family and around their peers, but particularly their parents, right, who ontologically speaking are their primary educators, right, who are always going to be more important for that kid's formation than you are ever as a teacher, as an educator, as an administrator, right? And this is mostly the result of just, once again, straightforward restructuring where they spend their time and they're at home more, right? Those students need to see mom and dad more than they see their math teacher, more than they see their science teacher, right? They get to spend time working through problems, hopefully with mom and dad, or a sibling or whatever. And they spend more time in a place with people who give them their sense of identity in a way that you cannot as a school, right? Hybrid schools allow the time and lack of structure that are necessary for those kids to devote their energy to accomplishing tasks that are not efficient ways of gathering information, but the information that they are gathering there is way more important than any of that classroom stuff. And I want to give some real straightforward examples, right? I'm going to give Leanne Warren a shout out here in a second. Our kids in our high school, right, spend 3 days a week in the classroom, which means they spend 4 days at home, right? And those home days, when they're actually being given assignments, those assignments are essentially things that you don't need me for, things that you don't need a teacher for, right? We don't need 8 hours a day with a kid in the classroom listening to Mr. Span give his lectures, and then we have a discussion, and then we watch a video, and then we start an essay, and then we do some busy work, and then we do X, Y, and Z to fill gaps, right? Those days in the classroom, when you actually have FaceTime with the teacher that knows what they're doing, you're spending that time listening to lectures, you're spending that time with guided discussions, you're spending that time doing Socratic discussions, you're going through all of these things that are necessary to have the educator there. But then at home, you're doing all of these things that I think are more important than what's happening in the class, but it's supplemental. And you don't need an instructor there necessarily, right? Things like journaling assignments, spending time discussing questions with relatives. I gave an assignment the other day to a group of 7th graders to go home and ask their parents how we can both agree with Christ telling us that we should love our enemies, and at the same time saying that, no, there's such a thing as just war. Go home and ask your parents, how come we can say we can love people, and also sometimes it's okay to shoot them, right? How do we do that? And talk to mom and dad about that and write the answers down. Writing letters is another thing that we're big into. Going outside and physically doing a thing and being connected to the real world. Our science class has wonder walks, and it involves going outside and finding things and writing down questions about it. That's cool. That's great. And that can take 5 minutes, or it can take 3 hours. Whatever that kid, whatever they're doing and however that's structured. It does require some onus from the parents to be involved, but it's wonderful. Religious activities obviously are a big one. Listening to good music. I could spend all day talking about Mrs. Warren's listening journals, which are fantastic, right? Where basically these students go home and they listen to a piece of music, not one time. It goes on for weeks sometimes, right? The same piece of music, and writing about it. Writing about what they're thinking, writing about what it makes them feel, writing about connections that they're drawing to other things. These things that are not practical to do in a classroom, but are so important. They're more important than what's actually happening in that classroom. Basically, those home days exist for any activity other than listening to me talking in front of them while looking at a whiteboard, right? And that lack of organized time on home days is why we do what we do and why it works. Last week, I assigned my students to go home and look at Raphael's School of Athens. That was it, and write down what they thought. Write down what they saw. And some kids, they cranked out 2 sentences of nonsense. And some kids wrote pages upon pages of just beautiful connections that we then led to a discussion in class, right? So I love that. Last little just fun assignment that I throw out there because I think it's neat. With my 7th graders and with my junior theology students too, sometimes I assign them to do a cool thing. That's what it says in the lesson plan. It says, go home and do a cool thing. And I put some parameters. The cool thing cannot have anything to do with anything digital. The cool thing, sometimes you have to do it with a sibling or a parent. Sometimes it has to be outside, but it's go home and do a cool thing. And the last point that I want to make from a practical standpoint is not super politically correct, but I think it's really important for us to embrace from just a purely practical marketing standpoint. Like me at the beginning saying I was attracted to this, I was attracted to classical education because it was a sort of a finger in the eye of modern education, whatever you want to call it, right? Classical hybrid schools are kind of like a double finger in the eye, right, to modern education and the whole modern education structure, because it rejects everything that the vast majority of what I like to call modernist imperialism, but you might not like that term, everything that is being promoted by the public school system that our parents have a lot of righteous disdain for. And I'm not just trying to get a dig in at everything that I think is wrong with education in the 21st century, but from a marketing standpoint, it makes sense. Your parents are already probably fed up with the public school system, especially post-COVID, right? They're fed up with Common Core math. They're fed up with gender theory and whatever other things you want to put under the wokeness umbrella, right? That's being handed down to them from all of these supposed experts. And your hybrid school being classical is just another selling point. And as a bonus of it being really good marketing, it's the best way to educate our kids, and it could potentially save us all from dinosaurs. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. All right.
Thank you, John Henry. I think Heidi is going to go next.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And thank you for that. So I want to start out by talking about what is a classical education. Offer a, if not a definition, at least a guiding line for what it actually is. It's a word that's gaining, this is a renewal. I prefer the word renewal to movement because a classical education is a return to something. And the classical education renewal began for me, if you're quoting Dr. Ian Malcolm, right? I'm not trying to one-up you or anything, but I'm going to quote Socrates.
Basically the same thing, though, isn't it?
Right.
I mean,
Who said that the goal of an education is to love what is worth loving. And that's a very meaningful statement in a world that has lost a central meaningful statement, right? To your point, John Henry, that you were making about what goes on in a classroom, emphasizing academics, a classical education, the goal of an education, having been handed down from the first classicist, right, Socrates, saying that the goal of an education is to love what is worth loving, not to know what is worth knowing, or to earn what is worth earning, right? To produce what is worth producing. All those things might be tangential. They might come from loving what is worth loving, but they need to be within a context of love. And it does matter what we love. It matters a lot. If we love money, we will act accordingly. If we love wisdom and virtue, we will act accordingly and make decisions accordingly. And so the goal of an education, now it's so countercultural, we have to give it an adjective, right? Classical. But it shouldn't be. And that's what the renewal is all about. We don't want this to be an adjective describing a brand of education, one of a myriad of choices, right? This is an education. And so the goal of an education is to love what is worth loving. And in order to do that, we have to cultivate the whole person. Socrates argued in the Republic that an education educates two modes of being within the human person. The spirited mode of being and the philosophic mode of being. The mind, right? That's the philosophic part of us. And also the body, the spirited part of us, which also includes what he called the chest, right? Which is the honor-loving part of us. The part of us that longs to take action in the world in an honorable way. And classical education starts with the assumption that that is an inheritance that belongs to everybody. That is what it means to be a complete human being. And to educate the soul means to educate the head with knowledge, and also the chest with virtue, and also the belly, which is the part of us that is appetitive, right? This is Socrates' three-part soul or tripartite soul. I always tell my students when I teach them this, go home and impress your parents at dinner, talking about the tripartite soul. It sounds like jargon, but it's not. It's not jargon, right? It's reality. We have these three parts of us, and they must be drawn up, which is what education means. Comes from the Latin educare, which means to draw up, to lift up, to elevate and ennoble. And that's what an education ought to do. And that's what all of us are attempting to do, whether we are doing classical education or not, right? Which is why classical is not an adjective, right? And so in order to do that for our students and for ourselves, because most of us are re-educating ourselves as we go on this journey, right? We give them something worth loving. So a classical education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue through nourishing the soul on goodness, truth, and beauty. By means of, and this is where we get practical, right? By means of the 7 liberal arts, so that the student is enabled to know and love God and his creation. That's where the Christian part of a classical education comes in. However, the classical education model came from the pagans. So it was completed in Christ for those of us who believe that, but it did come down from the pagans. And so this is an education that includes all knowledge over all time. And this is why it belongs, I think, I've educated my children classically in a hybrid school model their entire education. from kindergarten until now. I have a 16-year-old son. He's a junior in high school looking at colleges and career path. And I have a 14-year-old daughter who's beginning high school next year. This has been their heritage the entire time. I haven't done it perfectly, but I did it because I believed in it. And I think that the hybrid school model is particularly conducive for a classical education because it creates space for a conversation. And from the time from Socrates, Jesus, and all of the great thinkers across time, as they have taught this, they have done it in conversation, right? So if you take a classical education and you keep it merely at home, you run the risk of it becoming simply uploading propaganda into the minds of your child, right? Like, this is how I think, this is how we think, this is our family, and this is what we do. That's not truly classical, because a true classical education is engaging in conversation. What Socrates called the dialectic, which is a guide further along in the journey, but has not arrived, taking along with them those who are a little bit behind in their knowledge, and imparting that knowledge through conversation that leads towards truth. This is where we get the idea of the forums, by the way. If you're not super familiar with the Republic, this is what Socrates did. He took his interlocutors, his conversation partners, he asked them questions to lead them towards truth, and then said, once you had visualized truth, you must return and impart that to the next generation. And that is what we are attempting to do through classical education. And that is really useful. The hybrid school model is very useful for that, right? Because it takes what I believe are the three main streams of formation for a human soul, which is the family, and the meaning-making stories you're telling them, the church, right? Or the faith of the family, and then also the family and the school, right? And the hybrid school model leaves space and holds space for all three of those streams of formation to nourish the soul of the child. And so in a classroom, I'm a classroom teacher, I'm not an administrator. I do teacher training at my school, but I just want to be with the kids. I want to talk about the books. That's why I'm here, right? And so I have classroom time to do what a classroom can do. To your point, I loved what you said. Do in your school what they cannot do at home, and give them to do at home what they can do on their own. That is a great guiding line for pedagogy at your school, right? For the scope and sequence. They cannot have a Socratic discussion just at home with their siblings. They need a guide. So unless a parent is trained in that or can do that really intuitively, because we're not all about certification, right? Then it's helpful to have a classroom for that. And I also teach at an ecumenical school. We're represented in all three here, right? I teach at a Christian ecumenical school. You're at a Catholic school. You're in a public program, right? And so this is possible to do across the board with different levels of regulation. Got to be creative, to your point. You got to stick some fingers in eyes, which shouldn't be that way. We're not just trying to be dissident, right? We're actually trying to uphold a tradition and return to something that has been assumed to be the way to educate humans for thousands of years. The fact that it's a small pocket is a travesty, right? But that's where we're at, right? And so it's also a political education in the sense that we are talking about, as Socrates said in the Republic, the city is like the soul. How we govern our souls is how we ought to govern our cities. What does that mean? That's a conversation, right? This is the dialectic. This is something we're talking about. So classical education doesn't belong to the right or to the left. It belongs to all political traditions, just as it belongs to all religious ones, because it is an ongoing conversation about how to apply wisdom and virtue to the city and the soul. And so we take these ideas and implement them within the hybrid school model, and you have family, you have faith, and you have the tradition. And those three streams naturally belong together, holding equal space for each one. And I'm going to pass it off to Brian at this point. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. It's always deeply interested me how both educators and parents choose a model or method of education and then a mold of education. And when we talk about hybrid and classical, those really are two separate things. You can have hybrid without classical. You can have classical without hybrid. And so it's an interesting thing to ask the question, why would one be chosen over another or in conjunction with the other? When I considered perhaps, I guess from my standpoint, the most beneficial way today to prepare my remarks, I wanted to look at those points of compatibility that I've often found between hybrid school parents and educators and classical school parents and educators, and why those compatibilities exist. As the blurb to the session says, why they tend to be a match, right? Why they tend to be a match. I would put forth the compatibility is most seen in 4 particular areas through the mutual affirmation of 4 particular ideas. There's probably more, but I got 8 minutes, so I'll give you 4. First, both are deeply innovating with old ideas. Both hybrid schools and classical schools are deeply innovating with old ideas. I'm working on a book right now called A Little History of Education, where I just want to take the whole history of humanity and say, what is education? And write it in a way that's approachable for every single person that's had probably a 7th grade education and above, right? And when I looked at far ancient education, there's just like primitive natured education that never, ever goes away. You can add on whatever you want to. Doesn't matter what the funding is. Primitive elements of education never, ever, ever go away. And so both hybrid and classical ed are deeply innovating with old ideas. And that sounds really weird, doesn't it? Right? But we're deeply innovating with old ideas. Parents and educators are drawn to the various hybrid models of schooling, and classical parents and educators are drawn to classical ed. They have a tendency to have done their reading. It's pretty cool. It's a bunch of smart people. They've done their reading to have looked closely at the history of man and the history of ideas and considered what has been lost and what we should be recovering. Right? Heidi said renewal, what we should be renewing. In doing this, their innovation is one that's truly creative. It's breaking a mold in which both our contemporary models of ed and our curriculum pedagogy appear to have gotten stuck for about like 95 years, right? Stuck. And this innovation has proven to be deeply practical and effectual at even the goals set forth by contemporary models and modern aims of education, right? Hybrid ed and classical ed, they just win at the game that's been set up outside of them. They do more, but then they win at the game, right? You can see the test scores that have come from the past 30 years of classical ed and hybrid schooling. You can see the number of colleges and universities who are chomping at the bit for these sort of scholars to enter into their school, right? I once had at a conference, I spoke with, he was a recruiter for the Air Force. And he said, we've really turned our attention away from public schools. I was like, really? Why? These are like your institutions. You are a government-funded institution. Why would you turn your backs toward recruiting at public schools? And he said, we're not getting missionally aligned students. We're not even getting students who have a wish for something beyond their own appetite. They don't wish to be held to a standard beyond their own self-expression. And when you think about the purpose of a military for the health and future of a nation, right, and having recruits that don't wish to abide by any other command other than their own self-will, right, that's the problem. So first, they're both deeply innovating with old ideas. Second, both classical ed and hybrid schooling take very seriously the Latin dictum multum non multa, right? Kind of very popular in the classical ed world. It means not much, not many. Much, not many. Multum non multa. Hybrid schools seek a model that is what I call the 3 E's of organizational health: effective, efficient, and enjoyable. Right? Effective, efficient, and enjoyable. If any one of these is missing, there tends to be real problems in any kind of organization. Classical ed seeks to the same aim of not adding more classes or more books or more required credits, but adding the best or the right ones in the right ways at the right times. There's a kind of qualitative aim rather than a quantitative aim that both hybrid schools and classical schools seek. We do not wish to ultimately see 24 credits. We wish to see a scholar who loves and pursues the true, the good, and the beautiful, who is articulate and competent and confident in who they are as humans and as an individual. And we seek for all this to happen in the most effective, efficient, and enjoyable way possible for them and for their families. So first, both are deeply innovating with old ideas. Second, both take the dictum very seriously, multum non multa. And then third, both take very seriously the kind of fuller complexity and broader consideration of who should form the scholar. Who should form the scholar? I loved when I was, it happens even now, but any time I've led a school, I always get questions from parents, like, are you guys going to plan to do this? Right? Are you guys going to offer this? Right? And it really hit me. Like the first few times I got the question, I was like, oh no, we didn't even think about that. I need to go to the board and say, hey, we didn't think about offering this. Parents are wanting it. And then I go, wait. Is it our responsibility to do that? Right? So I like telling my faculty, and I like thinking through this as well for my own kiddos, but when a child is born into the world, any point of human history, they're born into 4 societies. Usually 4. Definitely 3. Definitely 2. Mostly 3, almost always 4. Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. They're given a family, aren't they? Doesn't matter how orderly or chaotic or dysfunctional a family is. A baby is born into a family. They are then made political citizens, right? They're born into like a national definition. They're made civic beings. Boom. Citizenship. So they're born into a family. They're born into a political society. Then that family usually gives them some type of religious society. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter how different it is from you. Doesn't matter if it's polytheistic, monotheistic, atheistic. Doesn't matter. They are typically given a formal religious society. It's usually different than the family, right? Then they're given usually an academic society. Only a few times in history do we see those condensed down to like 2. In tribal areas, you see those condensed down to like 2, right? Where like the political society is kind of like the fullness of the religious society at the same time, but it's also functioning as the academic society, right? But the family is also a separate unit than the tribe. But you still see these 4 active and functional in the formation of a child. If you think about it for a moment, all 4 of those have their own kind of separate sphere of sovereignty and interest in how the child is formed. Our government has an interest in seeing human beings formed in a civic, orderly way. Because vice is very expensive. Vicious people are monetarily costly. They just are, right? Hybrid schools tend to take seriously these 4 societies and affirm their respective sphere of sovereignty in that each have a vested interest in the scholar being formed and shaped and cultivated in a particular way toward particular ends. And both my colleagues have alluded to this, right? They both said, right, there's a time and place for what the home should be doing, a time and place for maybe what the church should be doing, a time and place. And those somewhat overlap, but they're also really separate, right? They're also pretty separate. This is likewise true of classical ed and classical educators. In classical ed, it is not merely the academic and college readiness portion of the scholar that should be formed. And this means it is not the academic institution who is most paramount in the scholar's formation. The scholar is an intellectual and academic being, but he or she is also a familial being, a civic being, a metaphysical and spiritual being, and a private and social being. Hybrid schooling gives time back to families. It gives time back to the book of nature. It gives time back to the child's self-will and interior motivation to be fully human. It gives time back to the church or to the city or even to the academic institution itself to provide balanced opportunities and touch points so that the list of those who influence and shape the scholar is a more complete, holistic, and balanced in accordance with the more complete and accurate truth of who the scholar actually is and is intended to be. Both hybrid schooling and classical ed have a deep compatibility in that they both take seriously who should form the scholar? Fourthly and finally, both hybrid schooling and classical schooling tend to attract parents who are deep thinkers and have been made free by kind of focused commitment. They quoted Ian Malcolm and Socrates. I'm going to quote Chesterton. 2 quotes. He said, education is violent because it is creative. It is creative because it is human. It is as reckless as playing on the fiddle, as dogmatic as drawing a picture, as brutal as building a house. In short, education is what all human action is. It is an interference with life and growth. After that, it is a trifling and even a jocular question whether we say of this tremendous tormentor, the artist man, that he puts things into us like an apothecary, or draws things out of us like a dentist. Mr. Shaw and such people are especially shrinking from that awful and ancestral responsibility to which our fathers committed to us when they took the wild step of becoming men. I mean the responsibility of affirming the truth of our human tradition and handing it on with a voice of authority, an unshaken voice. That is the one eternal education. To be sure enough that something is true, that you dare tell it to a child. Say it again. That is the one eternal education. To be sure enough that something is true, that you dare tell it to a child. Next quote. The true task of culture today is not a task of expansion, but very decidedly of selection and rejection. The educationist must find a creed and teach it. Even if it not be a theological creed, it must be still as fastidious and as firm as theology. In short, it must be orthodox. Out of all this throng of theories, it must somehow select a theory. Out of all these thundering voices, it must manage to hear a voice. Out of all this awful and aching battle of blinding lights, without one shadow to give shape to them, it must manage somehow to trace and to track a star. So think about those last 2 sentences, right? Education is about tracking a star to which you would probably give your whole life. In fact, you're going to. Right? You are giving your life to something, and you will hit the grave, and you will have only 6 feet that you actually need. Me too. Right? So something is going to slowly kill you, and that's going to be what you give your energy to. You track a star in education, and that's where you go. And then his other point is, you believe in something so much that you would tell a child, right? So the blend here of what we find in classical ed and hybrid schooling are the parents I find that say, you know what? We care so much about certain things that we are going to make sacrifices, right? We're going to sacrifice maybe what our family might think. We're going to sacrifice maybe how I was educated, what's comfortable, right? What's known. We're going to get into this ed choice sphere. There's probably some like weird things happening, and we're going to get out from underneath the comfort of probably contemporary American culture, and we're going to do it, right? That's another intersection that I found, and it's a beautiful one. It's great to see. I did have one more, but I know we're out of time, and that was that hybrid and classical school parents and educators not only care about who teaches the child, but what is being taught, and that's a big one too. But I'll save that for a later publication or something.
Okay, we have time for questions. I think for the sake of the recording, I'm going to put the mic back up. And if you have a question, just be brave and come up and ask it.
Shut up.
Somebody should be coming. Like,
Guess I'll use the mic. My handheld girl. Question, Bridie. You said you do teacher training at your school. The classical education is a huge passion for us. Most of us weren't classically educated ourselves. and neither were our teachers, neither were our parents. So what approach do you use at your school to get your parents and teachers the best education they can get in classical education as well?
That's such a good question. At my school, St. Hilde's School, I pretty much do modeling for them. In Greek, it would be called mimesis, right? So I bring in my teachers and I include them in a Socratic dialogue. We read a text together and then I guide them through the text as I do my students in my high school classes. And then we'll switch to I teach the great books. I teach history, literature, classical performance, poetry, and philosophy. So I teach a complete humanities course, but it's the kind of teaching I do can be in any class, like any subject. And so then I'll switch over to a different subject and teach a science lesson in the same kind of way to the teachers there. And then I have them model it back to me. And I do give a little bit of feedback, but I am working with professional adult humans. And so they can take what they need and leave what doesn't work for them in their classrooms and with the students that they're teaching. I also offer them, and in my modeling, I use from Aristotle's Rhetoric, the 5 common topics. That's the foundation. So this is something you can Google. It's available all over the internet. It basically uses, for any subject on the face of the earth, you can use the 5 common topics to teach, which is, so let's say I wanted to teach my kids about rocks, right? Which I don't teach that class, but I could with the 5 common topics, right? What is a rock? That's the first common topic. Do you name, what is it, right? This is a rock. Okay, what is it? The second one, how is this rock different from this rock? Comparison, right? How is it the same? How is this rock different? How is it the same? Color, shape, texture, whatever, right? Where did this rock come from? That's another common topic. And then a third is what happened as a result of this rock. And then the 5th would be, what do other experts say about this rock? What has been written about it and talked about it over the centuries, right? So this is a comprehensive way of teaching anything. And it's very, very useful and helpful. This is classical pedagogy. It's much simpler than you'd think it would be if I say Aristotle's Rhetoric. Like, that's intimidating. But if I just talk about what stuff is and how it looks like other stuff and what happened to get it there, right? Like, that's what it means to teach classically. And then Socratically, I also teach by asking questions and getting a response, challenging my students if they, or expanding on what they're saying, using that dialogue, which is a little bit more tricky to get the hang of, but it's certainly not intimidatingly hard. Yeah. Good question.
Do you model it for parents too?
If they want to. Parents, yes. And parents, so here's what happens with parents. This is maybe just true for me. This may not be true for anybody else in the whole world. But I say to parents, tell me all the time, I love what you're doing in the classroom, or I hate what you're doing in the classroom, or challenge me, whatever. And then they'll say, can I come in and observe? And I say, anytime, anywhere. I love having parents in the classroom. You are always welcome. We are partners. And then they don't come. I've only ever had like 3 parents come to my classroom, but they're always welcome. And even that open door policy, I think, is encouraging to parents. We have tried at our school to do parent trainings, and they are somewhat useful. And if parents want it, it's always available. But a lot of parents are really more looking for a drop-off program, and that's completely fine. But for us, you're always welcome. And we would love to teach you this stuff and talk about this stuff because, as has already been mentioned, we're all re-educating ourselves along the way. Very few of us have received this. And so one of the great joys of doing this is that we also are learning to love what is worth loving. Yeah. That's a good question.
I have. Ellen said, like, I won't drop it either. Yeah. So a question that comes up a lot with hybrid schools is this question of access, right? So it's not full-time homeschooling, but you still really need some help at home, right? And that maybe is difficult for some families, right? And in the last couple of weeks or months, there's this question has also come up about classical education. That is classical education too exclusionary, right? Or if it's not, is it just becoming watered down, right? So could you talk about, any of you, about either of these? Like, what are some ways that we could increase access to hybrid schools or to classical education, or even better, to classical hybrid schools?
How many, by show of hands, how many in the room are just educators? You don't have children in a classical or hybrid school. You're just a teacher and administrator. How many of you are parents and not teachers or administrators? You're parents only. How many of you are both administrators and parents? How many of you have a hybrid school right now? How many of you have a class school but not hybrid school? How many of you have a hybrid but not classical school? Okay. The reason I ask that is because I want to tailor my answer, I think, in that direction, right? That we have in the room parents and educators, right? So your question was, how do we make hybrid schools more accessible to families, right? How do we make classical ed more accessible to families? All right. There's a lot of ways to go with this, but I'll give a few. The first one is, we have to look at these 4 societies that I mentioned, and we have to put pressure on all 4 of them to do their part. For example, if your state legislation creates a ceiling or a boundary for you where you can't have, like you should, a hybrid school or a classical school, that's a massive problem if you want to be law-abiding citizens, right? You could pursue mutiny if you want to or something, right? But that's a problem. So we need the city, we need the political sphere to do their job. We do, right? To create pathways of accessibility, of free market education, to open this thing up to be what it should be. That includes allowing financial dollars to go where they need to go, right? Because if we want to raise a population, which right now we have a dwindling population, right? Massive issue. If you look at the anthropology coming out over the next 50 years for the U.S., massive issue in our population decline, right? So if we want these sort of healthy elements that create the atmosphere for accessibility to good education, it's got to be on all 4 fronts, right? So that's a big one. I would say too that you have to think through the resources you have in your local community to create and then build, create and then build, and create and then build. So start somewhere and then create and build and create and build, and pull in other organizations, pull in a church, pull in a homeschool group, pull in an academic institution. You never know who's around as a professor in that academic institution wanting to be a part of building something pretty high, okay? So think about it this way. I mentioned the 4 societies, right? And if you think of the groundswell of culture in the U.S. right now, our kids are on the ground. Kids on the ground. And that groundswell is coming, right? And so we have to have all 4 of these stacked up to bring our child beyond that groundswell. So accessibility is high, and we need all 4 of those to have the highest amount of accessibility. To be really practical, I think there's a lot of incredible resources, this organization being one of them, that are coming on board right around the country. There's a ton of classical things. So, right, get in community to share ideas and to limit the obstacles to creating a hybrid school and then creating classical schools. I think that's my short answer.
Yeah, I think there's a psychological component too in regards to parents, where you hear classical and you think heady philosophy and difficult, just the level of participation from the parents, and they feel like they're not credentialed enough to do that. With our school in particular, from pre-K through 8, you have to register your child with the state. They're a homeschooled student, right? But then once you get into high school, they are a regular education student, just like they went to one of the local public schools or any established private school. And it is a big conversation that we have in open houses and things to sort of talk parents down from, we're not expecting you to teach calculus to your 16-year-old, right? Like I said earlier, and we all touched on, I think, the classroom time with the teacher is where you're going to be handling that instruction. Your job, mom and dad, the onus is on you at home to make sure that that child is in a place free of distractions where they can actually buckle down and do all that supplemental stuff. But your job is not to teach it to the child. Now, when we start off in pre-K with us, there's nothing that's required of the parents on the home days. They go home and have fun and spend time with your 4-year-old. And then that increases by the time you get to 8th grade. And I will admit, I've already had to Google how to do like long division and stuff for my 3rd grader because I'm not a math guy. But by the time you get to the really difficult stuff in high school, if you structure it correctly, you can take a lot of that fear away from parents, but that understand that, no, we have the experts in the classroom. Your job is just to make sure your child is devoting that time uninterrupted on those home days to get it done.
You go.
I want to address the issue of there's an ongoing conversation. If you've been around the classical education renewal for a while, there is an ongoing conversation right now about what does classical mean, right? And ought we to be gatekeepers to this education, right? And that is a very, very relevant conversation anytime there's any kind of social movement that gains traction, right? That begins in a pure form, and then it's along the way becomes more and more acclimated to the surrounding culture, right? This has happened in Christianity. This has happened in every major social movement in history. And classical education is not necessarily a major social movement, but it is a compelling alternative to the public school system right now for a lot of the reasons we've been talking about. And so the question of whether or not we ought to be gatekeepers at schools, hybrid schools included, is a major one. And I think that they're going to get lots of opinions by classical education leaders and practitioners. But I want to remind us that a very classical idea coming from Aristotle is that virtue is the mean between two extremes, right? And so if we have one extreme that classical education can just be like any other public school, but you read some books, that's wrong. That's not a classical education. Classical education is something. It's not just a conventional school that adds some extra curriculum, whether it's public or private. And on the other extreme is like kids have to pass some kind of like I know somebody I work with, actually a colleague I respect a lot, who's like, what if we just said you can't have an iPhone if you come to our school? That's an extreme position, right? So I think that especially in this culture. So if like I wouldn't even be able to teach without the internet with how much I use Canvas for the hybrid school, right? Like that's where my students are accessing their homework when they're at home. And so obviously the question of this zeitgeist, this spirit of this age with the internet and all that is very compelling and beyond the scope of this particular conversation. But remember that virtue is the mean between two extremes. And consider that when you're deciding how to gatekeep your school.
John Henry mentioned the psychological element of accessibility, which I think is a really fascinating one. And I just want to speak to that for just a moment. Truly, my favorite, so I spent 15 years in classical ed as a head of school and consultant, and et cetera. And then I jumped out for 2 years to go into healthcare leadership. Worked on a doctorate at Medical University of South Carolina, ran a large pediatric group in Louisiana, and worked around doctors who, had gone through a lot to be where they were. And I found myself in a 4-hour conversation one morning with a pediatric cardiologist about how to run his clinic. Right? Because he had not learned in medical school what it meant to just be a well-formed, holistic, functioning leader. Had not learned that, right? And so it was like 4 hours of actually talking through principles of classical rhetoric, ethos, pathos, and logos. It's a ton of fun, right? One what I love about classical ed and what I love about hybrid schooling is they're both deeply intuitive to every person in this room. So if you say, it doesn't seem very accessible, right? And probably my worst moment, I'm going to say, how accessible are you to yourself? And what I mean by that is you have to know yourself. Know thyself is one of the most important primary elements of just living a good life. Really. You know this if you're in a marriage. You know this if you have children. You know this if you've changed jobs. Know thyself, right? And so how accessible are the classical elements to you, to yourself? I would start there. How accessible is sort of creative, intuitive thinking of hybrid modeling to yourself? It's just deeply human, right? These are just deeply human concepts. So this isn't new research coming out to prove data has to go a certain direction until 2075 in order for the Democratic Republic of the US to get where it needs to go. Like, that's not what this is. This is a real deep consideration of, this is your humanity in full form, just being formalized in an education system. No matter how complex that system is or not, or where the funding comes from, it's a separate question, right? So the accessibility of classical ed and hybrid schooling really begins with a self-accessibility. It then moves into a realignment of your time and your values to actually build something in your own life, to actually come to a conference, well done, to actually contact a publisher, to actually talk to your pastor or your priest about doing this thing that they're probably really aware of but afraid to do. Talking to your policymakers, right? So accessibility for this kind of thing really does begin with you as a person individually. It then expands to those closest to you and then goes a little bit further out, right? C.S. Lewis, at the beginning of his work Athanasius wrote a work called On the Incarnation, and C.S. Lewis wrote a preface to it. And he said, hardly anyone can understand what people say about Platonists. Hardly anyone can understand what people write about Plato. But if you give a scholar or a student Plato, they will understand it really, really well. Right? And I think, again, back to both points that have been made here, like, this is not as scary as you think. I read one book cover to cover before the age of 21. I'm not kidding. 6th grade. Gary Paulson, Hatchet. It was kind of because I like had a crush on my teacher and she was pretty. So I did my homework, right? But like, I read one book cover to cover before the age of 21. My undergrad was architecture and design. And then at 22, I realized I wasn't a great reader. And then I discovered books. And then I was handed a book on classical ed. And then I said, this is a whole new world, right? So the accessibility really is one that starts within you, and then it goes out from there. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's 12:30, which means we're at the end of this session and lunch is ready. So it should be, or it's supposed to be ready. So thank you, John Henry, Heidi, and a lot of fun.
Thanks, Sarah.